Welcome to the first Pause for Thought with Rob Mitchell. The Mental Capacity Cat is essentially providing an opportunity to speak with professionals across health and social care and the legal profession to discuss the law, best practice, but also to provide insight into the thoughts of those working within the sector. And I'm absolutely delighted today to introduce Rob Mitchell, who is the Principal Social Worker for Bradford Council. He's also one of the authors of Social Work, Cats and Rocket Science. He's the winner of Social Worker of the Year 2015 and co-chair of the PSW Network, along with recently being given an MBE for services to the profession. So quite the CV there, Rob, and I'm absolutely buzzing to have you on our first edition. And you've agreed to answer some questions that I have for you. So would you mind if I just start by asking the first question? Nope. Or would you like to say?
Fine, no, just lovely to be here and really nice to meet you, Hannah. So let's go for it.
Cool, let's go for it. So Rob, what is your most memorable moment from working in adult social care?
Oh, blimey. So it's a long career in adult social care. Going back to the very early 90s, I got a job in a care home so I did a series of jobs that I struggled with when I left school. I didn't really do well at school, and I kind of messed around after school. And one day I happened to be going into a job centre. I worked in a petrol station. On my days off, I'd go to the job centre to try and get another job. And I went to this job centre, and I saw a colleague come out that I'd previously worked with, I think at the petrol station. And I said, "Oh, I thought you were working in that care home." And she said, "Oh, I left," and I can't remember what she told me, but I remember thinking, "Oh, there might be a job there." And people had told me before about that maybe I should work in care. Like my mum and dad were foster carers for a while, and they recommended it, but it never felt right. But then I thought, "Oh, well, there's a job there. Maybe there's something in the kitchen or something like that." So I phoned up the matron of the care home, and she said, "Oh no, we don't have men work here." So this was the early 90s, so probably before a lot of legislation that might help. But I do remember saying to her, "Oh, I thought you were an equal opportunities employer, and actually your name's been given to me by the job centre as an equal." I just completely, well, I'm lying. I wouldn't say winging it, but if I'm being really truthful, I was lying. So she said. So she changed the tune then. She said, "Oh no, I am really proud to be an equal opportunity employer. Why don't you come up and see me on Sunday?" And this was kind of the end of the week. So I went up to see the matron of this local care home, and I remember I was working at a petrol station, and I think I was on about £2.30 an hour, and she told me that she couldn't match that, and that she could only pay me, I think it was £2.10 an hour. So I'd be taking a 20 pence an hour pay cut. And I remember going home talking to my girlfriend who I lived with at the time, and we had to work out whether or not we could afford that. That was a lot of money. And then just turning up on Monday morning and working in this care home, and I could not believe my luck in terms of that first day working as a care assistant in a care home just changed my whole life, really. I couldn't believe that I got paid to be a carer. I think it's probably easy to say kind of 30 years on, but I like to think that if they'd have said to me, "Will you still do this for no money?" that I would have probably done it, because I just loved it so much. I absolutely fell in love with being a carer. Getting time to talk to people and help them was, for me, was a revelation, really. I was in my very early 20s. I was the youngest. I didn't have younger siblings to bring up, and so I'd never had a caring role, really. And to be given a caring role as a care assistant, I absolutely loved it. So so kind of, if people ask me about kind of memorable things in social care, the start of my career really is where I want to end my career, because I really want to be in a position where I can go back to being a carer, because I've loved social work. I've had a really good career in social work, and worked with some amazing people. But care work was just the best thing for me. In terms of kind of, there's been lots of memorable moments and lots of funny things that have happened along the way, and lots of things that I've got wrong in my career, which the book that you showed earlier, there's probably a little bit of therapy in that, because I was able to kind of, particularly I talk about the Elsie story, a lady that I worked with, and I got it spectacularly wrong as a social worker. And most of the stories in the books are composite other kind of people that we've worked with. Elsie is as true to what happened as possible, without it kind of compromising somebody. And I got it spectacularly wrong with Elsie, and that has been memorable, because I think that kind of helped change my approach to social work. One of the things that is kind of really memorable, and I get reminded of it every year, it's kind of is my one success story in social work, because I kind of write all the time and talk all the time about how I get it wrong, but I do need to kind of keep remembering. One person I think I got it right with. There was I worked as my first job as a qualified social worker was working on an older people's mental health ward. And I was pretty poor, really. I was probably in awe of the psychiatrist. I was scared of the nursing staff. I was on my own there, kind of trying to muddle through and trying to understand what this job was about, and getting it wrong. So when I look back now, I was churning out assessments that nobody would read, 40, 50-page assessments that I enjoyed writing, because I like writing, but nobody would read them because there was of no relevance to anybody really, other than myself and what I thought the job was. And then I would write out big support plans, and a lot of times I would be involved in placing people in care homes. So the consultant actually liked me, because what I did is I did what he wanted me to do. I emptied his ward. I had good relationships with care homes. I hope I was kind of still caring and still person-centered, but I know that I was quickly assessing people and moving people on, facilitating their move on. And one man in particular that I worked with had got some significant mental health issues, and had all his life. And he was brought into hospital, and he was absolutely written off by the nurse and the psychiatrist who admitted him that day. And he was 64, 65, so he kind of graduated from working age adult services into older people services, was kind of dumped on this ward, and they felt that he was a no-hoper. In their words, they were really derogatory about him, and he needs to be in a care home, and he needs to this, and he needs that. His wife's had enough. And sure enough, I, as a social worker who wasn't quite getting what I was there to do, processed him and did my big 50-page assessment and my big support plan. And I found him a place, a care home, and placed him at a care home. And I took him on the day. I usually didn't take people. Usually transport would be arranged, but for whatever reason, I took him on the day. And on the way to going to the care home, I had just a really lovely conversation with this man. And when I got back to work at the hospital social work team, my manager, she was a great manager actually, and I just kind of went in and started talking to her about him, and she just said, which kind of broke all the rules really, and she just said, stay involved, don't refer him on to the locality team who will do a review. Stay involved with him, see what happens, stay in touch with him. She didn't really tell me to get him out of the care home, to change his support plan. She just said, just stay in touch with him, because I was explaining that I felt that I'd got, there was a real connection. So I stayed in touch with him, and over about 18 months, 2 years, got to know him really well, and his wife, and he went home eventually. Yeah, I know, he went home, and he stayed in touch with me, and he knew where I lived, and every now and again on a Sunday afternoon, he would, probably about once or twice a year, he'd just knock on the door and have a chat with me, and it was just so lovely. And he died probably about 3 or 4 years ago, a bit longer. He sadly died, and every Christmas, that first Christmas card that you get from, somebody always goes early with a Christmas card, and it's like beginning of December. It's always his wife, and so that means kind of more to me than probably any other Christmas card that I get, and I got lots of things wrong. We get things wrong all the time in social care. We're only human, and I got that wrong. I started off getting that wrong, but actually through working in a person-centered way, it was an eye-opening kind of moment for me. And I realized, kind of working through him, that I wasn't there to churn out assessments and do support plans, that there was something really, really different in what social work was. And that Christmas card that comes each year is just a reminder of, sometimes sometimes we get it right, and it's kind of all right to be all right about getting it right, because I'm all right about getting it wrong.
Sure, Rob, that's so inspiring, and I think a lot of social care professionals, if they watch this, will relate to that. I'm sure there's a moment in almost everyone's career where they have that, oh my goodness, this is the reason why I do what I do moment. I've certainly had a couple of them with cases that I've worked on, and it is so rewarding when you see it in action and it goes right. That's just such an amazing story. Thank you so much for sharing that with
okay.
me.
I got a bit emotional. It's probably the first time I've ever, apart from kind of one or two relationships with people at work who I know really well, I probably don't talk a lot about that, that working with that particular man. So I kind of got a bit emotional kind of thinking about it. As I say, I feel more comfortable kind of talking about when we get it wrong, really. And as I say, I think the book, there's a few kind of success stories in the book. There's a story about Andrew, about him becoming one of the crowd that a colleague of mine, Elaine James, wrote, which is a really, really beautiful story with about a student social worker and the work with Andrew. But my writing tends to be about when we get it wrong, because there's often so much learning about when we get things kind of wrong. So yeah.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. And just to plug the book again, because as Rob's referred to it, I highly recommend that everyone purchase this book, because it's an absolutely brilliant book. And as Rob said, the story, the title actually says Stories of Making a Difference in Social Work with Adults. So if you're a social care professional watching this, you have to get this book. It should be on every university reading list, I think.
Thanks, Anna.
In my opinion. So you're very welcome. Thank you for writing it with Elaine and Hannah, is it? And
Hannah Morgan at
Morgan,
Lancaster.
Mark Harvey and Ian Burgess. Yeah, you guys, honestly, great book. Thank you so much for sharing it with us all. And I suppose I'll move on to the second question then, which I suppose in a way your story kind of quite nicely leads on to the question, which is, what 3 character traits do you consider are vital to be a resilient social care professional?
I think the first thing, I think resilience has got a bit of bad press, and I think it's an interesting word, isn't it? Resilience, because I have seen really legitimate arguments that that we need not confuse resilience, personal resilience, with a lack of, a substitute for a lack of support from organisations. So I think resilience is an interesting word. I think the first thing, usually when I talk to newly qualified, so I spend quite a lot of time talking to newly qualified social workers, and one of the first things that I usually say to them is, if you're going to do social work right, then you need a thick skin, and you need to prepare for not being the most popular member of the class. There's kind of two ways of doing social work, really. I think I think a lot of people fall into it like I did, and think they're doing the right thing by churning out the assessments and becoming a really good administrator and a good care manager. And I think if you want to go down that particular route, there's lots of local authorities that will take you down that route. There'll be private organisations that will. There will be line management arrangements that will facilitate that kind of social worker. And some people do make a career out of that. I think it isn't what we were educated to do as social workers. The stuff that we're educated to do is about people's rights, and ensuring that that we are the agent of last resort, really. We often say that when everybody else has left the scene, we want the social worker to be the one who's still there. And I always say about social work, about how fantastic a profession it is, that you might be the social worker that on one morning you're working with somebody, and you've come to work in your scruffy clothes because you're going to their house to clean it with them because they're moving on. So, and we do that. We literally kind of get on all fours and kind of scrubbing floors and all that kind of thing. So you might be that social worker that's doing that one Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, you might be the same social worker going to the same person and looking at admitting them under the Mental Health Act, or you might be talking to them about a court order about child protection. So I think, my goodness, it's what a profession to be in, where you've got to be able to balance that and remain the best support worker, the best advocate, the best therapist, whilst at the same time you've got all that inherent power of the state that you wield as well. And somehow with these kind of conflicting roles that you've got, you have to broker relationships with people and support people. So I think that it's such an amazing profession, and to do it well, as I say, you have to have a thick skin. One of the best, well, the best social worker I work with has probably got to his name quite a lot of complaints, and every single one of those never are any of those complaints from the people that we serve, ever. The complaints are from people who've got other agendas that are determined to pursue a particular outcome for somebody, and this social worker has just drawn a line in the sand and has ensured that this person's voice will be heard at whatever cost, however much it might have it might have an impact on their own career, it might have an impact on their relationship at work with people, it might hold them back in lots of other ways, but they've held the line because they understand what social work is. So I think that's the first thing, really, is just prepare yourself for you won't necessarily be everybody's friend. Being a social doesn't mean that you have to be difficult, doesn't mean that you won't have friendships, doesn't mean that you can work across different partnerships really well. But just as, like in an MD, in a multidisciplinary setting, just as the police officer and the nurse and the psychiatrist and the teacher, they all know their roles. Our role, what we bring to the party, what our kind of unique selling point is that kind of rights-based stuff, and that rights-based stuff can often be a hindrance to other people's agendas. So you're potentially placing yourself in a difficult position as a social worker if you do it right. I think you've got to have a second thing. I think you've got to have an interest in humanity. And I suppose I didn't realise when I kind of started the job at the care home, and I'd never thought about care work before, but I'm nosy, I think I'm interested in people. And I think that the best social workers, the better social workers, are the ones that aren't the care managers, are the ones that actually have got a genuine interest in people and humanity and sociology, and can kind of balance all that in their mind and kind of weave some kind of path through it. So you do have to be that kind of cliche people person, I think, is true. I think you do have to be very, very interested in what people say. And then I think the third thing in terms of what you would need is that you've got to have that interest in people, in humanity. But I think the third thing is being human, I think, is the biggest thing. So my sister had social work involvement. She lost her sight which was probably in her 40s, and through diabetes she went completely blind. And she used to talk to me about her social workers. And when I think back, she never told me about the social workers who were doing what she thought was social work. So she never told me about what the social workers were helping her to arrange. The only bit that she sort of remembered about the different social workers that she had was when they told her really human things about themselves. So she would always tell me about the social workers' children, and funny things that their children had done. And when a social worker said a funny thing, or when a social worker dropped their guard, and perhaps it was, an example would be during the election, they kind of let the guard down and said which way they were voting. It was the human aspect that she really focused on, and that was the relationship that she needed with the social worker. So I always think that we spend quite a lot of time, on myself and a few other colleagues, on social media, and it's really important on social media making those connections and talking social work and finding other people out there that kind of think like you, and then you find the most brilliant people. But I also think the other thing about social media is that it allows us all to be human, and if you want to say something funny or completely irrelevant, or just go down a different line of conversation, I think it just kind of allows us to have that kind of relationship that other people wouldn't necessarily see. I think people would only see you 9 to 5 being a social worker. And I think it's Isabel Trowler once said, the children's chief social worker, she once she was following myself and Mark Harvey. We'd opened up a conference, and Isabel came, and I rarely kind of, I remember kind of stinging criticisms from people, but I rarely remember anybody. If anybody says anything nice, I think it's kind of Catholic guilt and humility. I have to block it out. I can't listen to anybody being nice. But Isabel Trowler once said about me and Mark, she said that she liked our stuff, and which was lovely that she said that. But the thing that we were really buzzing about afterwards is she said that we made her laugh, and it were like, yeah, I'm all right with that. I if anybody thinks that anything's kind of amusing or personal or it doesn't necessarily have to be about social work. I mean, she did kind of clarify it and say, she said that that we can make her laugh, but she felt that was a good thing because for her it meant that we knew our craft, that we could be kind of funny about things, or we could be a little bit irreverent about things. And but yeah, I remember thinking that line stuck with me really, about kind of, you know, wanting to be human, and social work is all about that kind of human connectivity. So we do have to, it's the Ruth Allen quote about the messy stuff. We do have to hold boundaries, and you do have to make sure that that everything's appropriate. But goodness me, we've got to be people in our approach. We've got to be personable in our approach, and I find it easy because I know I'm talking a lot now, but that's because you're asking me questions. But I am.
It's very interesting stuff.
I'm naturally I'm a shy person, and I know it probably is not coming across in this interview because I can talk about social care. But I'm naturally kind of an introvert, as a colleague calls me. She says that I'm an introvert, and I am an introvert. And social media, I think, just gives me an opportunity just to be human and be comfortable, because I can tweet it and I can then leave it, and I'm not getting dragged into a conversation that I think what she calls me, a social assassin, I think is what she calls me.
That's brilliant.
Because we go to conferences and she'll get chatting to people, and other colleagues I go to will get chatting to people, and I'll be kind of stood looking really awkward in a corner, kind of uncomfortable in my own skin. And social media kind of gives me that opportunity to do that safely, really, where I can say whatever I want to say and get into whatever conversation. And it just gives you that kind of, I don't know. So that's I think they're the three kind of things that I think are important. And I wouldn't have thought, I don't think, in going into social work, that they would be the kind of things that I would recommend as for new social workers. But actually, that being human and having that human connectivity with people, and then being able to accept that you'll get some kicks along the way, that's probably my learning from my career is what I've needed to try and get better at. So whether it's useful for new people coming in, I'm not so sure. Either way, the newly qualified social workers have to listen to it when I do a session. So I hope it's resonating with them.
Well, it's resonating with me as well, Rob. You know, like, I think it applies to a lot of people in a lot of careers. So it's really useful stuff. Very wise words for those entering the profession. So thank you very much for sharing that as well.
Okay.
I suppose it wouldn't be Mental Capacity Cat unless I ask you some questions on the Mental Capacity Act. So I admittedly don't have an answer to this question, so I feel a little bit cheeky asking you, because I'm still in turmoil over what I would choose. But if you had to choose one of the 5 principles of the MCA, the Mental Capacity Act, as being your favourite principle, which one would you choose?
It is such a good question. Is that I'm gonna pinch that and use that interviews. It is a great one. So I think that they've probably changed over the years. So I think probably a few years ago, I think I would have started off by saying 3. So going back a few years, lots of local authorities and universities really kind of got behind understanding Principle 3, and we had great walls of unwise decisions. We had social workers holding photographs up with unwise decisions that they'd made, with a really relevant point being that the social workers had made these unwise decisions and it had no consequence in terms of their liberty or people making decisions around them. It were just really unwise decisions. So in the local authority I worked at the time, some people would hold banners up and for the Great Wall of Unwise Decisions, and it said things like starting smoking, and then other people would kind of be really open about it and say really kind of personal things about. So they'd say kind of getting pregnant and things like that, and so kind of getting into more kind of profound mistakes that people had felt that they'd made. But it was a great leveler actually doing that piece of work. I remember we had a meeting one day. So we had this in the office. Well, we've tweeted it quite a few times. In the office, we have this massive Great Wall of Unwise Decisions with probably about 50 social workers all holding up this. And we got the chief exec of the council to do hers, and we got the director to do his, and all this kind of thing. And we just off where this wall was, we had a small meeting room, and I remember one day we had a meeting with a young woman with a learning disability and her parents, and it was a really difficult meeting because this young person was exploring sexual relationships for the first time, and the mum and dad were really, really struggling with it. And when we came out, we just happened to be kind of chatting next to the wall, and the young woman that we were with pointed to the wall and said, "Oh, that's my social worker. What's this?" So her and the mum and dad ended up walking to the. It was like we couldn't have scripted it better, really. So we were kind of explaining to this family kind of what this is about, and it just related so much to the conversation that we were having about her right to make these decisions, which might seem unwise, but actually to her at that time were the most. She felt she'd fallen in love with this guy, and all that kind of thing. So I probably would have said 3. A lot of my conversations around MCA and around the principles are around Principle 1. So Principle 1's a really important one in terms of the presumption that's made, the othering in social care, the fact that we often have to remind ourselves and then strive to remind others about principle 1 being the absolute key here. Let's start from that, absolutely vital. But I think over the past few years, I've probably settled on, I think I can probably answer it. I think it's, for me, from a social work perspective, it's 2. Because I think 2 are the, 2 is the stunning stories of social, and not just social workers. I think it's kind of lawyers and so your own profession and judges at court of protection. And I think 2 is amazing. And I always, we ask a question at interview quite often, particularly when social workers are going for promotion, about tell us about the 5 principles, choose one of the 5 principles and tell us kind of what it means to you and what the work is that you've done around it. And I always kind of jump a little bit if somebody says 2, because I'm always like, really excited somebody's going to do a 2, because I think 2 is for social care workers. I think that's us at our best, really, our most creative and our most person-centered and our most thoughtful. So whether it's an occupational therapist or whether it's a social worker or a carer in a care home, I absolutely adore the stories around Principle 2. And I really love, I'm not techie at all, really, but I love the tech stories about Principle 2. I love this stuff about, social workers getting permission, going into people's houses and going around with a camera and recording it all, and then having conversations back in hospital beds about, when we're talking about where you want to go on discharge, let's just go back to your home, and do you remember this, and the memories that triggers, and the insight. I'm always wary of insight, but the awareness that gives them, and the support that it gives them for decision making under the Act, I think is I think it's Principle 2. Principle 2 are always the most kind of stunning stories. 4 and 5 are vital, of course. 4 and 5, the person lacks capacity to make the decision. So I'm always kind of intrigued with people's 4 and 5 stories, and they're absolutely vital that we get, the best interest, getting that checklist right, and knowing the checklist is absolutely vital. But for me in social work, the special stuff is always 1 to 3. It's about what we do to empower and support and best articulate that somebody has capacity to be able to make the decision, and then what support, that our work really begins then. Once somebody has capacity to make decisions, that's when their social work, people often think one of the criticisms of social work, we've tried to address it in a blog, but I don't think I wrote it well. A lot of criticisms we get as social workers is about when we say that the person has capacity and we close the case and we walk away, and people are really worried about that person. And our take on that is that that's when the social work starts. The minute you say somebody has capacity, they absolutely have the right to tell you just where to go as a social worker, and by goodness, you've got to do it. So if somebody tells you where to go, you've got. But the clever social work really starts at that point, because that's when, against all the odds, you've still got to try and maintain a relationship. The easy social work, in a sense, is when somebody lacks capacity, because it's stressful and it's difficult and it's upsetting for the person and their families. But there is laid out procedures for us to go to, and there's even a court at the end of it that makes all the decisions that we don't make. Somebody having capacity but still being at risk and having social care needs, or being the victim of abuse, is where the really clever social work takes place, the really skilled and insightful social work takes place. So so I would say principle 2, but next week I might have changed.
No, that's fine. To be fair, I think you're probably right on principle 2, because one of my absolute joys is when I'm reading through documents, if I'm preparing for court or anything like that on behalf of a client, is, well, what steps did you take? That's always the question that I ask. So what steps did you take to help that person make a decision, and what questions did you ask in order to satisfy whether that person can understand, retain, weigh up, communicate? Because without taking those steps, how can you possibly do an assessment? And it's brilliant to hear it come from yourself, Rob, because principle 2, I think, often is in some ways, and I don't mean, this isn't a criticism, but at times it can appear to be overlooked. So that's really cool. I wasn't expecting you to say principle 2. I was expecting either the presumption or least restrictive principle. So that's really cool. You surprised me really there.
Yeah, I think two's amazing. I think two's the one that I mean, the thing is about the MCA, for any of us that practiced before the MCA is still amazing, and is still the most empowering piece of legislation that I could envisage. And when I think back to the dark days of working without MCA, so when I go back to saying about being a newly qualified social worker and working on the wards, and when I'm churning out these assessments and placing people in care homes, I honestly, the legal status of those people, the way that we're making placements, the terms that we would bandy around, like we were making placements under common law without any real understanding of what we were doing. So terrible that people had to go through such outrages of abuse for us to get to the MCA. Particularly kind of Bournemouth and things like that around the Dolls. But I do think that it's the most a stunning piece of legislation. If you can get it right, and if you can make it the ethos of your social work intervention, it can be the start of something really kind of spectacular. And it brings social workers back to what they were trained to do, which is the main thing. It resonates with them. They don't want to do the care. Once you start talking to them about rejecting the care management stuff and concentrating on the rights-based stuff, it's like, that's what I was educated to do. That's what I want to do.
Brilliant. I did have 2 more questions, but I suppose it's kind of the same question. So I'm just gonna combine it and ask you this. So, do you have any words of wisdom for professionals in the run up to the Liberty Protection Safeguards implementation? And I'm going to give you 1 step. So what's the first step that you think public bodies should be taking to prepare for the LPS?
Okay. So none of my words are words of wisdom. They're usually just pilfered from other people, or the random and unhelpful. I would say there's a couple of things. I would implore all local authorities to employ an MCA lead, not a DOLS lead, not an LPS lead, not a consultant to come in and help you implement a change in legislation. I would implore all public bodies, really, the NHS as well, to employ a dedicated mental capacity act lead, because in my experience working across 2 local authorities, they're the culture changers. They're the ones that can properly get you, whether it's LPS or DOLS or any other aspect of MCA. We desperately need MCA leads. I often think I wish we'd have put the same resource into MCA as we did into the Mental Health Act. In terms of the Mental Health Act, I'm sure there'll be big gaps because there's gaps in provision right across the board. But there's some really good administrators and there's some really good Mental Health Act leads, and local authorities tend to know who their MHA lead is, and they have a lot of sway. And I wish we'd have put as much effort into MCA. Anyway, so I think it's that. I think it's about having an MCA lead. I think the thing to prepare yourself for LPS, and the work that we're concentrating on, is understanding what about necessary and proportionate. And that's leading us to review support in a way that we've never done before. So there's a couple of ways that local authorities, I think, review support. I think they often dress it up as about demand management, and talk about kind of recovery models, and actually a lot of times I think it's used as a little bit of a disguise for cuts. And you know, as a profession, particularly working in local authorities, and we are cash strapped in local authorities, but we reject that notion. We are absolutely not there or interested in things that cut. What we are interested in, though, is things like the least restrictive option. So if somebody's got 5-to-1 support in a care home, which is something that was advocated to me a couple of weeks ago, that this person needed five or had got 5-to-1 care in a spot, out, regardless of the fact that, you know, please goodness, go to court before, you know, don't implement that on your own local authority. But actually, the least restrictive option is what you need to be reviewing. And if that ends up saving the local authority money, that's a byproduct of a human rights based approach. Actually, that people shouldn't need 5 people around them all day. That's the most oppressive prison regime that you could possibly imagine. So necessary and proportionate, I think, is really important. I was talking to a colleague the other day. We were talking about the myths of social care and how a one-off incident in somebody's life can result in a restriction that is neither necessary or proportionate. We've had examples where there's been issues. There's one person living in a care home that wasn't allowed in the kitchen of a care home where they'd lived for 20 years. And when we found out why, it was because on admission to that care home 20 years ago, there'd been one issue with a knife that wasn't properly documented. Nobody got hurt, but there was an issue with a kitchen knife 20 years ago, had been denied. So you know, the knock-on impact of being denied access to your own kitchen for 20 years. He couldn't get a glass of water when he wanted, other than in his bedroom. He had a sink in his bedroom and he had to drink the water. And if you kind of drink water from your upstairs bathroom, it's not the same as your water. I don't know why. It's not the same as your water downstairs. Yeah, it's not, is it? It tastes different.
No, it's not. It's a weird flavour.
Yeah, exactly. So this guy, whenever he wanted a drink, would have to get water from his bedroom. Wasn't allowed to if he had visitors. So his family used to visit. He couldn't take them. He's, you know, more than able to make them a drink and something to eat and this, that, and the other. Every time that he wanted to have access to the kitchen, he had to ask one of the care staff to go and open the kitchen, and they would supervise with him. And it got to the stage where we were talking to the care staff, because this was a 20-year-old restriction that had been in place. They didn't know what they'd got to the stage where the myth of the knife had even been lost over time. So they didn't know why the kitchen couldn't be open to him. There's a couple of staff that still remembered the knife story, that when he was admitted there was an issue with the knife. Nobody was around at the time of the knife story. So over time, things had changed around this person and around the care regime that different people had come and gone, but the restriction applied all the way through. So I think it's about properly challenging ourselves as social care professionals about necessary and proportionate. And it's one of the things that we've done is we've set up peer challenges, where the best challenge is actually is your social work colleagues. So if you've got a particularly restrictive care plan, or a care plan that in any way, shape or form does not articulate the rights of the person all the way through, we've set up a system whereby that's open to challenge, a safe challenge from social workers. That's worked really well. That's been kind of quite empowering. So I would kind of recommend that. And then I think the final thing that I would say about kind of preparing for LPS is sign off. Local authorities that see LPS in the similar way that they've seen DOLS as an administrative task, is that whenever you need to be properly qualified to put your name anywhere near a DOL or LPS. You need to understand the best interest checklist and be able to properly talk about it. It's not an administrative task. It's not a managerial task either. It's not just something that somebody just high up enough in an organisation should have the right to do. It should be based in practice. So I think that they're the things that local authorities need to think about. There's some real worries about LPS. There's some real concerns about LPS. To an extent, I'm quite critical of local authorities in terms of what we've ended up with LPS. I'm not critical of the civil servants that have drawn, and the lawyers that have drawn up LPS, because I think they've done it in good faith and based on the feedback that they were getting from people that were administering DOLS. And I think the meetings that I went to and the conferences that I went to that included important people in health and social care, the advice that the civil servants were getting was that this was expensive and it was bureaucratic. But actually nobody was talking about the human rights element of DOLS and the human rights element of MCA. So the fact that we've come up with LPS as a bit of a streamlined version in parts, I kind of feel like, well, we probably got what we were asking for, really, and we didn't give enough credence to things like the House of Lords report in terms of their findings around it. We listened to the statutory bodies, the NHS and the local authorities, and we've ended up with a piece of legislation which, fingers crossed, it turns out to be significantly better than what we have. But yeah, the kicking of the civil servants and the lawyers never seemed particularly fair in my eyes.
Well, I mean, of course, as a lawyer, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for that. I had absolutely nothing to do with the preparation of the legislation, of course, but I will say I'm very much looking forward to the code of practice, and seeing what that's going to come out and enlighten us all with when it comes out for the public consultation. I think it'll be interesting, and I am quite happy to see it's going to be an MCA and LPS code of practice. Yeah. I think the cross-referencing, the ability to be able to do that will be very helpful for professionals on the ground, and I think the code of practice is going to be a key document along with some of the regulations to flesh out really the meat on the bones of what LPS is going to mean for social workers, for health professionals on the ground, and appropriate persons, all of the new terminology, approved mental capacity professionals. I am very excited about that new role, because I do really believe that provides that additional safeguard and oversight, and almost the promotion. You can't avoid the promotion of best practice with a role like that. And I'm really excited to see how that's going to work in real life, not just obviously from the brilliant papers that I've read and the intention behind it. And I'm going on now, Rob. This is supposed to be an interview with you, but
that's really interesting.
But yeah, I'm just, I'm so happy you joined me today for the first ever Paws for Four with the Mental Capacity Cat. I'm so happy that you shared such wisdom and some amazing stories from your experience, which I'm sure a lot of people, if they watch this video, will certainly benefit from. So I'm really, really happy. Thank you for accepting my invitation. And of course, if anyone wants to follow Rob on social media, I'll add the links in. When I post this video, I'll add all the links in and stuff. You can keep up to date with all his funny, quirky, introverted Twitter posts.
Awkward Twitter posts.
They're fabulous, absolutely fabulous. And I also recommend you follow the MCA Bradford team on Twitter too for the Friday quote of the week, which is always every Friday I go on that page and I look forward to seeing what quotes.
Yeah, it's brilliant, isn't it? I love it. Yeah,
awesome stuff going on at Bradford, and fantastic leadership as well, Rob. So it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you for coming on today.
Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thanks, Rob.